He didn't go out with a roar. There were no banners, no tribute reels, no sold-out arenas chanting his name one last time. Dan Severn, the Beast, one of the most dominant forces in early mixed martial arts, simply faded. While the sport he helped legitimize exploded into a global empire, Severn stepped away quietly, unnoticed. And in that silence lies a tragedy, a forgotten warrior whose impact was never properly honored. He fought over 100 times, brought real wrestling into the cage, and helped turn a blood sport into a sanctioned profession. Yet, when it was over, there was no ceremony, no final fight, just stillness. As the bright lights turned to newer names, Severn's shadow stretched further away until it was barely a whisper in MMA history. This is the story of a giant whose fall no one heard, not because he wasn't great, but because we stopped listening. And now, it's time to listen again. He wasn't just a fighter, he was a freight train with cauliflower ears. Coming from a decorated amateur wrestling background, Severn gave early MMA something it was desperately missing: legitimacy. He wasn't a street fighter or a karate black belt looking to test his style. He was a disciplined combat athlete with a resume that stretched across collegiate wrestling mats and into Olympic trials. When he slammed opponents into the canvas, it wasn't for show. It was the manifestation of years of grinding, blood, sweat, dedication, a technique forged from training, not just instinct. When he entered the UFC in 1994 at UFC 4, the landscape was chaos. The Gracie family was running the show. Fighters were strikers or brawlers, often gassing out within minutes. Then came Severn, 250 pounds of control and violence wrapped in a singlet. He manhandled Anthony Macias, forced a tap from Marcus Bossett, and even gave Royce Gracie all he could handle in one of the most grueling fights of that era, pushing the jiu-jitsu icon for over 15 minutes before being caught in a triangle choke. But even in loss, he proved that the tide was turning. Technique was evolving. Wrestlers had arrived. By UFC 5, Severn had claimed his first tournament championship. By UFC 9, he was crowned Super Fight champion after defeating Ken Shamrock in a painfully slow, strategic battle, one many criticized but few understood. Severn didn't care for showmanship. He didn't care for entertainment. He was there to win. And win he did. He wasn't flashy. He didn't cut promos, but his presence was undeniable. With his thick mustache, bulging traps, and calm, dead-eyed stare, he was as terrifying outside the cage as he was inside. Severn wasn't interested in selling the fight, he was there to finish it. And in the chaos of early MMA, where fighters often relied on brute force and little training, Dan Severn was an anomaly: methodical, professional, dominant. But for all the battles he fought, there was no coronation, no official passing of the torch, no real acknowledgement of what he meant to the sport. Even as the UFC began to grow and polish its image, Dan Severn's name was slowly brushed aside, like an old war relic that didn't fit the shiny new narrative. They called him the Beast, but in time, the sport he helped build outgrew the man who gave it structure. Most fighters fade by the time they hit their late 30s. Their bodies break down, their reaction times dull. The calls stop coming, but Dan Severn never stopped. He didn't just walk away like others. He kept fighting, into his 40s, into his 50s, against younger men, in smaller cages, on cards you had to search to find. It wasn't pride, it wasn't greed, it was something far more complex: commitment, identity, the purest form of being a warrior. After his early UFC run, when the organization began shifting toward entertainment, Severn moved across the globe, taking fights in regional circuits, overseas promotions, and hybrid shows. He stepped into cages, rings, and even gymnasium, wherever the contract landed. By the end of his career, he'd racked up over 125 professional MMA fights, an astronomical number in a sport where most careers barely scratch 20. Severn wasn't padding his record, he was testing himself time and time again. And he wasn't just winning by flukes or decision squeaks, he was dominating, even when the spotlight was long gone, even when the audiences shrunk to a few hundred people sitting on fold-out chairs. He never announced his retirement. No press conference, no farewell fight, just a slow drift into obscurity. One day, The posters stopped, the offers faded. His body couldn't give what it once did, and still, he didn't say he was done. In interviews, he would pause when asked if he'd fight again. "You never know," he'd say, as if the beast was only resting, not gone. Fighting, for Severn, wasn't a job, it was a language, a way of being. And in his eyes, as long as he could still train, still teach, still step onto a mat, he wasn't finished. But the world around him had changed. MMA had become a business, a show, and Severn didn't fit the mold. So the cameras turned away. The reporters stopped asking questions. UFC highlight reels no longer showed his slams or his arm locks. It was as if his hundreds of fights had been deleted from memory. No farewell tour, no legend label on broadcasts, just silence. But in that silence, he endured. Because Dan Severn never needed a crowd, he just needed the fight. As MMA entered its mainstream era, signing TV deals, airing on ESPN, boasting million-dollar payouts, Dan Severn's name became a footnote, a trivia answer, a shadow on a wall of newer, flashier champions. The UFC stopped mentioning him altogether, even as they built tribute packages for fighters with half his resume and a fraction of his impact. And slowly, Severn began to vanish from the sport he helped legitimize. It wasn't that people hated him. There were no scandal, no embarrassing public breakdowns, just indifference, cold, calculated corporate indifference. He didn't fit the narrative anymore. He wasn't marketable. He didn't have the right look, the right soundbite, the viral moment. The media wanted brash, tattooed warriors with UFC gold and Twitter beefs. Dan Severn gave them none of that. He gave them technique, humility, and work ethic. And in a world obsessed with drama, that wasn't enough. Severn didn't complain. He didn't call anyone out. He kept training. He showed up to smaller promotions to support fighters. He gave seminars in middle school gyms. He mentored young athletes who barely knew his name. He walked among fans as a legend in plain clothes, and many didn't even recognize him. The beast became a ghost. And when fans started noticing this eerie absence, when older MMA followers asked, "Hey, whatever happened to Dan Severn?" there were no answers. No major articles, no UFC tributes, no Hall of Fame induction, just crickets. He was there in the beginning. He stayed through the grind. And when the lights got bright, he was gone. Before there was structure, before there were weight divisions, before the gloves and the rounds and the regulatory commissions, there was chaos. And in that chaos, Dan Severn was the anchor. He brought something that many early fighters didn't: discipline, a real background, a blueprint for success beyond raw power or wild striking. He didn't just show up to fight. He showed up with a legacy in amateur wrestling that demanded respect. Severn's presence legitimized the UFC in ways no marketing campaign could. This was a man who had wrestled at the highest collegiate levels, trained with Olympic teams, and then walked into the cage not as a brawler, but as a professional. It was a shift, one that helped transform cage fighting into a sport. He didn't have the mystique of the Gracies, the showmanship of later stars, or the violence of the brawlers. What he had was mastery. He proved that grappling wasn't just about stalling, it was a path to dominance. He made takedowns terrifying. He didn't just fight to survive, he fought to control, to suffocate, to methodically dismantle opponents. And that mindset rippled through the sport. Severn was among the first to show that the cage wasn't just a place for bloodlust, it was a canvas for strategy. Beyond technique, he also bridged audiences. Dan Severn walked the line between MMA and professional wrestling before crossover was common. He appeared in WWE during its Attitude Era, holding the NWA title while still actively competing in real fights. He showed that it was possible to wear both masks, the entertainer and the athlete, without selling your soul to either. He didn't fake fight to get famous. He fought because it was in his blood, and the entertainment world simply wanted a taste of that real energy. While others cashed in on highlight reel knockouts, Severn was accumulating victories the hard way, quietly, with respect, with intention. Fighters like Randy Couture, Matt Hughes, and even Khabib Nurmagomedov owe a debt to the templates Severn helped create, a wrestler's dominance mixed with real-world composure. But here's the tragedy. You won't see his name on UFC broadcasts. You won't see him coaching on The Ultimate Fighter. You won't hear Joe Rogan celebrating his influence. It's as if the sport collectively agreed to forget its foundation. And Severn, ever the quiet professional, never asked for anything. No parade, no documentary, no interview circuit. He helped build the house of modern MMA. And then, quietly, they locked the door behind him. After the cameras moved on, after the main events became younger and flashier, Dan Severn didn't retreat into bitterness or bankruptcy. He retreated into something much harder to maintain: honor. Instead of chasing clout or selling exaggerated stories for podcasts, Severn turned to service. He built a life rooted in community, coaching, and discipline. The same values he carried into the cage, he now carried into local gyms and community centers. He started a gym in Michigan, training high school wrestlers and aspiring MMA fighters, most of whom had no idea who he really was. To them, he was just Coach Dan. He rarely told war stories unless asked. He didn't brag about choking out champions or walking into UFC 5 with zero fanfare and walking out with the sport's future in his hands. He taught, he mentored, he picked up the mats when class ended. The beast became the builder. He also took on security consulting jobs, sometimes working alongside law enforcement to teach restraint techniques and self-defense. He did charity events, attended local wrestling tournaments, and always, he kept his head down. While other legends sold their image to the highest bidder, Severn held his quietly. He didn't license his name for energy drinks or NFTs. He just kept being Dan Severn. But this humble life came with its own quiet burden. While the UFC grew richer and the sport's fame exploded, Severn never cashed in. Despite being one of the earliest champions, he didn't get retirement benefits, no legend bonus, no free rides to UFC events. When the organization sold for over $4 billion in 2016, no one sent Severn a check or even a thank you. Still, he showed up when asked. If a young fighter wanted a seminar, Severn would drive across state lines to do it. If an old friend asked for a corner in some small-town fight, he'd show up. That was the code he lived by. Loyalty, legacy, not headlines. Yet even loyalty can feel like exile when the world forgets your name. And slowly, as the years rolled on, fewer people remembered what he meant. Fewer people asked for interviews. The respect didn't fade, but the attention did. And for a man who never asked for the spotlight, that fading light was the one thing he didn't deserve. In a sport that thrives on myth-making, how do you forget a man like Dan Severn? The UFC celebrates its showmen. It builds statues for trash talkers, rematches for rivals, and marketing campaigns around drama. But Dan Severn didn't come with theatrics. He came with results. And that, maybe more than anything, is why he was ignored. He never threw chairs at press conferences, never insulted opponents' families. He didn't create headlines with post-fight call-outs or viral chaos. His fighting style wasn't built for highlight reels, it was built for domination. It didn't make fans scream, but it made opponents quit. That's a dangerous formula in today's world, where sizzle sells more than substance. Even in his peak years, Severn was overshadowed. The rise of Ken Shamrock's charisma, Royce Gracie's mystique, and the eventual arrival of Conor McGregor-style promotion left little room for a man who preferred to let his actions speak. And so, the UFC leaned into its future, leaving the past buried. There's also a darker truth. Severn never played the political game. He didn't buddy up to Dana White. He wasn't part of the Zuffa-era transformation. He didn't fight in the Ultimate Fighter boom. And as newer legends emerged, Couture, Liddell, GSP, Severn's era was painted as primitive, less evolved, less modern. That perception became the coffin of his legacy. Even his Hall of Fame absence feels intentional. Severn was one of the first champions, a multi-time tournament winner, a record-breaking warrior with a 100-plus fight resume, and yet no plaque. No speech, just another name on a record list too few people read. Why? Because he made it look too easy, too real. Because he reminded the sport of its roots, when it was raw, dangerous, and unpolished. In a world that wants polish, Dan Severn remained a mirror of what MMA used to be. And sometimes people don't want to look in that mirror anymore. But the truth remains. Without Severn, the foundation crumbles. He wasn't just part of the beginning. He was the reason there was a beginning at all. For a man with over 100 professional fights, most of them victories, you'd expect a moment, a Hall of Fame speech, a video package, a crowd of current fighters standing up, applauding the man who made their careers possible. But for Dan Severn, that moment never came. And perhaps the most painful truth of all is that he never expected it. He didn't think he was owed anything. And that humility? That's exactly what made the silence around him so deafening. The UFC Hall of Fame has honored pioneers like Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock. It celebrated showmen, brawlers, and modern champions. But somehow, they forgot the man who bridged eras. Dan Severn was the missing link between shoot wrestling, Olympic-level grappling, and full-contact MMA. And yet, when induction time rolled around year after year, no call. Fans online have started to ask the question. Forums, Reddit threads, and podcasts have occasionally dared to say what the UFC won't. Why isn't Severn in the Hall of Fame? He won more tournaments than some inductees. He fought more frequently. He represented the spirit of the sport at a time when few others had the discipline or experience to. Still, no recognition. There were whispers of politics, that he wasn't part of the Zuffa-owned golden age, that he didn't have the same relationship with Dana White or the Fertittas, that because he didn't retire under the UFC banner, he was passed over, quietly, permanently. But the real sting is that Severn's contributions go beyond numbers or nostalgia. He was there when it was dangerous, when the sport was banned in multiple states, when there were no weight classes, no gloves, no round breaks. He took the risk before it was profitable. And somehow, that bravery, those years, got swept under the rug because it didn't fit today's marketing script. He's not the kind of legend that sells pay-per-views. He's not a meme. He's not a viral clip. He's a craftsman, a builder, a cornerstone. And in today's spectacle-driven fight world, that's not enough. But it should be. And the question now isn't, why hasn't Dan Severn been honored? The question is, what kind of sport forgets its very foundation? Dan Severn may be forgotten by the sport's biggest promoters, but his legacy hasn't died. It's just taken root in smaller, quieter places. His fingerprint is all over the evolution of MMA, even if the new generation doesn't realize it. His influence is in every dominant wrestler who controls a fight from top position. It's in every fighter who trains not just to knock someone out, but to master them, to break them down, and dictate pace, position, and pain. Wrestling-based fighters today don't necessarily name-drop Dan Severn, but they live in a world that he helped build. Without him, the wrestler's rise in MMA might have taken a much longer path. Severn proved, long before it became fashionable, that wrestling was the most dangerous base in the fight game. Not because it landed a single lucky shot, but because it neutralized everything else. And his work ethic? That's legend. Severn didn't just train to win fights, he trained to be unbreakable. He traveled across the country giving seminars, building a grassroots network of fighters who grew under his system. Not sponsored, not corporate, just gyms, mats, and knowledge. Thousands of young fighters and coaches have learned directly from Severn, often without even knowing the scope of his resume. Even his demeanor has left a mark. He wasn't brash. He wasn't loud. He never once used his opponent's names to sell a fight. He just fought. And today, there's a small but growing respect for that. As the hype machines burn out, as fans grow weary of drama for drama's sake, there's a new kind of reverence for the quiet warriors, the ones who came to work, not perform. Severn was that man before it was cool to be that man. And in the end, that's what separates him. His legacy didn't come with fireworks, it came with foundation. While others built towers of fame, Severn poured the concrete at the bottom, solid, unshakable, overlooked. And for those who trained with him, who listened to his lessons, who learned from the way he carried himself inside and outside the cage, he's not forgotten at all. He's immortal. There was no last walk to the cage, no gloves left in the center of the octagon, no teary-eyed post-fight speech. Dan Severn's career just ended. One day, the contracts stopped coming. One day, the opponents got too young, too fast, and still, he didn't say the word retired. He didn't mark the day. Because for Severn, The journey was never about the finish line. It was about the road. And that road ended not with a roar, but with silence. He didn't demand a documentary, didn't ask for a seat at UFC events, didn't complain on social media. He walked away like he fought, with dignity. And in doing so, he revealed something deeply uncomfortable about the fight world. It's not just what you accomplish, it's what you market, it's who you know, it's how loud you yell. And Dan Severn was never going to yell. He didn't know how. So the sport he helped build left him behind. Fans moved on. New champions rose. Old tapes collected dust. And Dan Severn, the beast, the builder, the father of the grind, faded into the background. A silent goodbye to a noisy sport. But maybe now it's time to bring that silence to light. Maybe this generation, those discovering the roots of MMA, will look back and see what was lost. Not just the man, but the values he carried. Discipline, humility, consistency. Not for fame, but for the fight itself. And maybe someday soon, someone will say his name into a microphone. Maybe they'll read his record, watch his tapes, stand him in front of a crowd, and let the applause wash over him. Not because he asked for it, but because it was long overdue. Because Dan Severn didn't just fight. He showed us what it meant to stay fighting, even when no one was watching.